Hi, I'm Karl Schmidt, owner of Dakota Tin Works in Esteline, South Dakota. I've been asked to give a video demonstration in which I make a reproduction Civil War tin cup. The particular cup that I'm going to reproduce for you comes from the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia. Museums can be great resources for antique tinware and for studying how tinware was put together in the past. This particular cup was carried by either a Confederate or a Union soldier, we're not really sure which. It's a small cup. The nice thing about this listing is that it shows us some photographs of what the cup looked like, a description of how it's put together, and most importantly, some dimensions. And so based on this information, I've been able to reproduce this particular cup. When the cup was new, it would have looked something like this. And so this is the kind of cup that a soldier could have easily carried. It doesn't weigh very much. It holds 8 ounces. And it would have been an inexpensive cup for the time. There are cups from that time period that usually have wired lips or a wired handle or both, and those would have been more costly simply because they took longer to make. When I make reproduction tinware, I usually work on a prototype, and that prototype is based on the measurements that I am provided in a listing like this or from an original. I will then produce 1 or 2 of these prototypes and measure them, check them out, make sure they're to my liking. And if they meet all the requirements of the original, then I will proceed to make a pattern. The patterns are useful tools for historical tinsmiths because I can put some effort into making sure that the measurements of this are all just the way I want them to be. And then from that point forward, I can reproduce as many of these cups as I want. I'm an historical tinsmith and I do this for a living. It's not a hobby, so making patterns is a very important process in reproducing tinware. This particular pattern has 3 pieces. There's a body, which is essentially a long rectangle. There's the bottom, which is simply a circle. And then there's the handle, which is this piece here. So it's a very simple design, much like many other cups. But this one, the design and the construction details are pretty simple. And so I'm able to reproduce this for you in the amount of time that I've been allocated. So what follows will be about 35 minutes of different segments showing how I make this particular cup. You'll see the antique tools that I use, you'll see the entire process from laying it out, cutting it, right through soldering the cup and seeing the finished product. So for most of that, I will be off camera. You'll hear my voice and you'll see my hands working the tin, but because I don't have a professional video studio and camera people to help me, I have to do this all on my own. So you'll still see the process, and I think that's the most important part, and then I'll be back at the end of the video to make a few comments in conclusion. So sit back, I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you at the very end. Thanks. I thought before I got started making the cup, I would talk a little bit about the materials that I use in making reproduction things like Civil War cups. In my shop, I use 2 kinds of tin plate. There's electroplate, which is a modern product. It's produced in a factory. It is based on a thin sheet of steel that has been coated electrically on either side with a thin coating of tin. This is a relatively recent form of tin plate. It came from the 1890s forward, and I use it to make decorative pieces from more modern decorative pieces, such as ornaments and tinsel. It's not the kind of tin plate they would have had during the Civil War. So I don't use this kind of tin plate. I don't use electroplate for any of my reproduction work. The kind of tin plate that I do use is something called hot dip tin plate, which is what this is. This is also a thin sheet of steel that's been coated on either side with tin. The tin coating tends to be thicker, heavier, and the process is different. This is actually steel that's been dipped into a vat of molten tin repeatedly until you get the level of coating that you want on either side. It ends up showing little imperfections and marks on the surface, almost a kind of slumping pattern. And so you can easily distinguish hot dip tin plate from electroplate because the coating is not perfect. The electroplate is uniformly bright, uniformly shiny, and so you can easily tell that this is electroplate and this is hot dip tin plate. So if we're looking at trying to get as authentic a product as possible in these modern times, then what I would say is that if you want to make something that's a reproduction, you use hot dip tin plate. This is difficult to obtain, and so there's only one vendor in the United States that sells it, and so I always make sure that I try to buy a significant amount of hot dip tin plate from him so that I have some in the shop at all times. With most of the things I make, at some point I have to solder them. And so I use this kind of solder to join the materials. In the 19th century, they would have used an alloy solder that was 60% tin and 40% lead. I've opted to move away from pure authenticity and use instead what's considered a pure tin solder. I cut little pieces off this or dip my soldering iron at the end of it to get the solder. And so this is about as pure a product as you're going to get. There are some trace elements of other things in them, but this is considered by the company that makes it to be a pure tin solder. When joining pieces, I have to have a flux, so I use the kind of product they would have had again in the 19th century, which is a ground resin. It's just a powder, and this acts as a flux to move the tin along the joint whenever I'm soldering it. So if I'm making something like this little container, you can see this has a lap joint, and there's a solder line along it. And what I would have done is simply apply that flux along the edge and then drag my soldering iron tip along it after coating it with a bit of tin. So those are the kinds of materials that I use. Like I said, I strive for authenticity whenever I can, but I will stray from pure authenticity in trying to use a more healthful product that does not contain lead. I don't use any lead in my shop at all, so anything that I make, whether it's something that you would drink out of or something you would simply handle like a lantern, I use only pure tin solder. So the next step would be to take the pattern and lay it out on the tin plate that I'm going to use to make the cup. And so this is actually what would be considered a full sheet of hot dip tin plate. It's approximately 10 by 14 inches. And this is the standard size sheet that they would have had during the Civil War. So what I usually do is this is the body, I lay this out on the edge so I don't have to cut that particular edge. And I mark it out on the tin plate with the scratch awl. Being careful to hold the pattern up against the tin plate, so that's laid out. And then for some of the smaller pieces, what I usually try to do is find a piece of tin plate that I've used for something else and cut some out of. And so there's an odd little bit here just to be frugal. And so I'll trace out the bottom on this. And then the other piece is the handle. So I went in my little box and I found a small piece of tin plate for that. And I'll lay that out on the edge just like I did with the body. And then trace it out. So the next step is to cut the pieces out. So I'll set the pattern pieces aside for now so they don't get in the way. And I'll start with the handle. So I just get a pair of tin snips or shears and start to work my way around the lines that I've scratched in the tin plate. I'll come back and cut that little rounded piece in a minute. So with a circle, what you typically will do is try to cut as close to the line as possible to get some of the excess tin out of the way, because I'm going to cut this around the circular line, and if you have too much material in the way, what it starts to do is bind and makes it difficult to cut. So I'll try to trim that out a bit. People often ask me, how long it takes me to make something, and when I do demonstrations, they typically will only see the part that takes the least amount of time. And what I tell them is that the cutting out often will take longer than some of the other processes. So it's not that exciting to watch somebody cut. But for purposes of this video, I thought it would be important for you all to see what that process is like. And you have to have just the right kind of light to do this. I sometimes do this in front of a window, but at this particular workbench I've got good light, so it shows me where the line is. Alright, so that's that bit. So I've got the handle, the bottom, and the next piece is the body. Okay, set that aside. So there's the body, and now I just need to trim the ends here where the notches are. So that's the body of the cup, and the bottom, and the handle. So the first step in forming the body of the cup would be to put that decorative bead down the length of it. There are a number of different ways to do that. I could use a creasing swedge, which I own, but it's a hammering type tool and it makes a lot of noise. And so what I'm trying to do is limit that because of the video. And so what I've opted to do instead is to use this turning machine. This particular model dates to 1867, but they had turning machines decades before. The operation of it has remained basically the same all of those decades. So it's a 2-die device in the front. It has a groove in the bottom die, and this top die goes down into the groove, pushes the metal down. I've set the depth gauge for the proper depth, so that I can run the tin plate up against it and it'll remain even. So I'll go ahead and start this. And what I want to do is just put a very slight crease in it to start. And then I'll run it through again. And I'll tighten it down a little bit more, and I'll keep it up against the depth gauge here. And then again. just a little bit more. Okay, so that puts the decorative bead in the cup body, and then now next I'll take it over to the folding machine and I'll turn the lip over. All right, now I'm at the folding machine, and what I'm going to do is fold this lip over. And so I've set the depth gauge accordingly, and I will set this in here, line it up in the middle, and then fold it. And what it does is it creates a nice uniform fold across the length of the cup body. And what I'll do is take it over to the stake plate table, and I will use a mallet to tap this down so that it's flush with the body of the cup. Alright, so I've started to shape the body of the cup on the conductor stake. A lot of my tools are from the 19th century, and they've seen a lot of use over the decades, and they often are scratched. And so just to make sure that I don't end up completely scratching the inside of the cup, I just put a little piece of paper, scrap paper, around the conductor stake and work my way around. And this, sometimes takes a little time to get the right curve in it. So that's about right. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and solder this, and then once it's soldered, then I'll come back and make sure it's completely round all the way. Alright, so the next stage is to form the handle. As you can see, the handle is shaped somewhat like a half a heart. So that's the shape I'm going to make, and I will do that on the other end of the conductor stake, also covered in paper. And what I like to do is take a mallet and just hold the end down as I'm shaping it so it stays in place and doesn't slide around. And that's the shape you get. So I've come over to the soldering table, and I'm going to begin soldering the body of the cup. I'm just going to put a little bit of rosin there along the seam. I'm holding it with a pair of pliers so that it's good and tight. I'll just get a little bit of solder and tack that down. Then I'll turn it around and tack that on the top. And then once it's tacked on the top and the bottom, what I like to do is start working the seam a little bit and try to make the cup a little more round before I finish off the rest of the seam. Okay, so that's it. So the cup body's been soldered, and I'll go over and do the burring of the bottom of the disc, and then we'll have to prepare the handle, and then we can finish soldering the cup together, and then that'll be it. So the next stage is to burr the bottom. Now this is an antique burring machine. It dates roughly to the 1850s or 60s, and it's in great shape, and this is the one I use for all my work. So I like to wear a glove while I'm doing this so that I don't catch the sharp edge on me. And so the way this works is it will turn up the edge as you're going along, and so I'm going to tighten it down a little bit and work my way around. And it has a depth gauge just like the turning machine, and the depth gauge keeps the burr the same size. This is one of those procedures that is difficult to master, but is essential if you're going to do this kind of work. And so once you get the burr all the way around, you can start to push your hand up against the bottom of the cup bottom and create the burr. And then that's what that looks like. Alright, so now I've got the three pieces that go into making this cup. I've completed the burring of the bottom. I put my mark on it, my maker's mark, and I've got the handle ready. So what I need to do next is put this cup bottom on the body, and so if I've done the burring correctly, it should fit on there very snugly, and it does. Let me just make sure everything's lined up the way I want it before I commit to soldering. Yes, okay, so that's nice and tight there. And then the cup handle will go on here. So we'll do the soldering of the cup body first. So back then they often would just solder on the outside, and so I'm going to do that, and then I'll show you something that I do typically for a cup that's going to be used by someone. Put a little bit more flux on there. So go ahead and wipe off the tip of the soldering iron. Okay, so that completes the soldering of the outside. Now, what I typically like to do is solder the inside as well, simply because when these things get used by someone today, sometimes they drink things that get stuck in the crease where the solder doesn't necessarily meet, and I want to make sure that people don't have problems later on. So I typically will solder the inside as well. So I'll go ahead and do that. Now, when I've examined original cups, they often are not soldered on the inside, and if I was making this as a reproduction for a museum, I likely would not solder it on the inside either. But since the cups I make typically are used by people and aren't museum pieces, I think it's best to ensure that my customers are happy with the final product. So you can see, I believe, how I'm soldering the inside right along the joint between the side of the cup and the bottom. Now this does get quite warm, so sometimes I have to stop and let it cool off, or sometimes I'll wear a pair of gloves, so I might do that. Put on a well-worn pair of gloves. Put a little bit more flux in there. Tiny bit more solder. And then this will complete the soldering of the inside of the cup. Alright, so that's the finished product. You can see it's a nice, neat solder job. And that will keep any liquids or anything that someone might drink out of this from getting into the seam and messing up the cup. Alright, so that's that part. Now I will have a look at the handle. And so we'll do the handle next. Alright, so I've positioned the handle on the seam side of the cup body. And what I like to do is sort of line it up down here and also up here so that it looks like a neat product. So I will just tack the handle in place. There.
position the handle where I want it. Sometimes you have to manipulate the tin plate a little bit to get it to form up against the side of the cup. And so then I'll get a little flux in there. Alright, and then you can see how I will solder this in place. Sometimes I have to move my hand a bit because it gets hot, and just want to double check to make sure everything's lined up properly. You don't want to solder it in place and then find out the handle's crooked or something. Alright, that looks pretty good. And then I'll do the other side of this. Okay, so that essentially completes the cup. It's soldered all together, and sometimes I like to go back in here. In fact, I'll go ahead and do that. I'll go back in here and solder the top here so that the handle is more secure. Get a pair of solder snips and this just keeps the top of the handle from collecting water or anything else, and is also makes it more secure. Okay, so that's nice and secure. Everything else looks all right. Okay, so that's the finished cup. And so now what I need to do is clean the flux off. So usually what I do is I scrape the flux with my fingernail, and then it goes into a small container of denatured alcohol, and that will then remove the remaining flux. And then after that it gets washed just with regular dish soap and dried very carefully, and then it's ready for someone to use.
Hi, I hope you enjoyed the video of me making the Civil War tin cup. I'd just like to show you the finished product. So this is what the cup looks like after it's been cleaned and washed. And I wanted to point out that I'll be donating this to the EAIA online auction. So if you're interested in bidding on it, you can go to the EAI website and find the auction link, and you'll be able to find the cup there. I'd like to take a moment to thank two men who have been instrumental in me becoming an historical tinsmith. One is Lauren Miller, who is the resident tinsmith at the Stuhr Museum of the Prairie Pioneer in Grand Island, Nebraska. And the other is Bill McMillan, who teaches tinsmithing workshops at historic Eastfield Village. Gentlemen, if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here doing this kind of work today. So thanks very much. At the end of this video, there is contact information if you're interested in getting in touch with me or asking me any questions. And so I look forward to those, and thanks very much. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.